German flame tanks, night terror on the battlefield, February 12, 1945. The Silo Heights east of Berlin. The night air hung thick with fog and the acrid stench of cordite. Soviet infantrymen huddled in their forward positions could hear it before they saw it, a low mechanical growl that seemed to rise from the earth itself, accompanied by the grinding of steel tracks on frozen mud. Then came the light. Not the sharp crack of artillery illumination, but something far more primitive, far more terrible. Orange flame erupted from the darkness, liquid fire that arced through the night like dragon's breath, turning the fog itself into a curtain of burning phosphorescence. The flames clung to everything they touched, sandbags, timber, flesh, transforming men into writhing torches whose screams pierced the winter darkness. This was the Flammpanzer, Germany's flame tank, and for those who faced it in the dying months of the Third Reich, it represented something beyond conventional warfare. It was fear made manifest, hell mechanized and sent rolling across the battlefield. The concept of projecting flame as a weapon was not new to the German military mind. During the Great War, Flammenwerfer troops had terrorized Allied trenches, their pressurized flamethrowers spraying petroleum across no man's land with devastating psychological effect. But those were men on foot, vulnerable, their range limited to 30 meters at most. What emerged in the Second World War was something far more formidable: flame married to armor, protection wedded to terror. The Flammpanzer combined the medieval horror of burning oil with 20th century engineering, creating a weapon that could deliver fire while weathering the storm of return fire that inevitably came when defenders realized what was approaching. The Germans converted several tank chassis into flame-throwing variants throughout the war. The earliest, designated Flammpanzer II, utilized the outdated Panzer II light tank hull, mounting a flamethrower in place of the main gun. Later came the Flammpanzer III, built on the chassis of the more robust Panzer III medium tank, and finally, the Flammpanzer 38T, constructed using captured Czech tank designs. Each carried roughly 1,000 liters of flame oil, a mixture of petroleum and tar that burned at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. The projector could shoot flame up to 60 meters in a single burst, though effective range was closer to 40 meters. In ideal conditions, a Flammpanzer carried enough fuel for approximately 80 seconds of continuous firing, usually discharged in short, controlled bursts of 2 to 3 seconds each. These were not weapons of sustained combat, but instruments of shock, designed to break resistance at the critical moment. What the crews who climbed into these steel furnaces expected was straightforward enough. They would be deployed against fortified positions where conventional assault had stalled. Pillboxes, bunker, complexes, fortified buildings, entrenchments, these were the targets. The doctrine was simple. The Flammpanzer would advance under covering fire, positioning itself within range while enemy defenders were suppressed. Then would come the flame, transforming concrete strongpoints into ovens, forcing defenders into the open where supporting infantry could engage them. It was brutal but tactically sound, a method for reducing fortifications without the prolonged artillery bombardment that consumed precious ammunition and time. The crews understood they operated a specialist weapon, dangerous to both enemy and operator, but necessary for the grinding urban combat that characterized the Eastern Front and the final defense of the Reich itself. What they experienced was something altogether different. The reality of operating a Flammpanzer was not the calculated assault of textbook tactics, but a journey into a peculiar circle of hell that consumed machine and man alike. The interior of the tank became an oven long before any flame was discharged. The heat from the engine, always oppressive in any armored vehicle, was magnified by the proximity of 1,000 liters of petroleum-based fuel. Temperatures inside the crew compartment regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius even in winter operations. Men sweated through their uniforms within minutes, the air thick and oily with petroleum vapors that seeped from the fuel tanks and caught in their throats with every breath. Headaches were constant, nausea was common. The fear was that a single spark, one electrical short, one fragment that penetrated the armor near the fuel reservoir would transform the entire vehicle into an instantaneous crematorium. Historical records from the 6th Panzer Division, which employed Flammpanzer III's during the desperate fighting around Kursk in July 1943, reveal the psychological toll. One crew commander, whose account was preserved in divisional after-action reports, described the approach to a Soviet fortified village. We could see the infantry pinned down 200 meters from the buildings. Our task was to burn out the structures on the eastern edge. As we advanced, the smell of the fuel became overwhelming. Tracer fire began to strike our hull, white phosphorus streaks in the darkness. Each impact sounded like a bell tolling. My radio operator was praying aloud. We knew what happened to flame tank crews who were hit. Better to eat your pistol than burn. The account continues with clinical precision. They reached firing position, discharged 3 bursts of flame that set the targeted buildings ablaze, then withdrew at maximum speed. The entire engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. The crew vomited from stress and heat exposure once clear of the combat zone. The records also reveal an uncomfortable truth. Flammpanzer units suffered disproportionate casualties not from enemy action, but from mechanical failure and accidental ignition. A Waffen-SS maintenance report from March 1944 documented that of 12 Flammpanzer 38T vehicles assigned to SS Panzer Regiment 2, 3 were lost to internal fires or explosions unrelated to combat, 2 suffered catastrophic fuel system failures that rendered them inoperable, and 4 were abandoned by crews who refused to operate them after witnessing the fate of their comrades. Only 3 remained in service after 6 weeks of frontline deployment. The weapon designed to break enemy morale was breaking the morale of its own operators. Yet for those on the receiving end, the terror was absolute and unambiguous. Soviet military reports, declassified decades after the war, describe encounters with German flame tanks in terms that transcend military language and enter the realm of nightmare. A Red Army sergeant, defending a housing block in Budapest during the winter siege of 1945, recorded in his diary, "The fascist flame machine came after dark. We heard it before we saw it, the sound of a tank but different, accompanied by a high-pitched hissing like steam escaping under pressure. Then the street itself seemed to catch fire. The flame was not like fire from wood or oil lamps. It was alive, seeking, flowing around corners and through windows like a liquid. Comrades in the ground floor were cooked inside their own skin. The smell was not smoke, but rendered fat, human tallow vaporizing. 3 men jumped from second-story windows rather than burn. One survived with broken legs and begged us to shoot him. We could not approach the building for 2 hours until the flames exhausted themselves." The psychological documentation compiled by Soviet military intelligence classified the Flammpanzer as a special category terror weapon, requiring specific countermeasures not for tactical, but for morale purposes. Standard anti-tank tactics worked perfectly well. The flame tanks were often lightly armored conversions vulnerable to conventional anti-tank rifles, mines, and artillery. But the visceral horror they produced among troops caused panic, disproportionate to their actual battlefield effectiveness. Soviet commissars were instructed to emphasize to troops that flame tanks could be destroyed like any other armored vehicle, that they were in fact more vulnerable due to their fuel cargo, and that allowing panic was playing into German psychological warfare objectives. Special recognition and rewards were established for soldiers who successfully destroyed flame tanks not merely for tactical reasons, but to encourage troops to stand fast rather than abandon positions when flame tanks appeared. The Germans themselves came to understand that the weapon they had created was as much curse as advantage. Flame tank crews could not be rotated through normal replacement channels. The psychological stress was too severe, the specialized training too intensive. Once a crew was assigned to a Flammpanzer, they typically remained with flame tank units until death, serious injury, or psychological collapse. This created elite but brittle units, highly effective in their narrow specialty but unable to integrate with conventional armor formations. Furthermore, the tactical vulnerability of the vehicles meant they required extensive infantry and armor support, consuming resources that might have been more effectively deployed elsewhere. A single Flammpanzer might break resistance at a single strong point, but the cost in support assets, fuel, specialized maintenance, and crew psychology was enormously high. By 1945, as the Reich contracted under Allied pressure from all directions, flame tank production largely ceased. The specialized components, the trained crews, the logistical infrastructure required to support them, none could be sustained in the collapsing German war economy. The remaining vehicles were committed to the final desperate battles in eastern Germany, thrown into combat in urban environments where their short range and vulnerability to close assault made them little more than elaborate targets. Records from the Battle of Berlin show 11 Flammpanzer vehicles deployed in the city's defense. All were lost within the first week of fighting, most destroyed by Soviet infantry using satchel charges and Molotov cocktails in close-quarters combat, where the flame tank's protective armor became a steel coffin. Throughout this evolution, one object became the grim symbol of the Flammpanzer's reality, the protective gauntlets worn by the crew. Standard-issue leather and canvas gloves were insufficient. Flame tank crews wore thick, asbestos-lined gloves designed for handling superheated metal and protecting against petroleum splashes. These gloves were bulky, reducing manual dexterity, making it difficult to operate controls or handle ammunition. But they were essential not for external threats but for the internal environment of the vehicle itself. Metal surfaces inside the crew compartment became hot enough to cause second-degree burns on contact. The gloves thus became both protection and prison, a constant reminder that the crew inhabited a machine that was as dangerous to them as to the enemy. Veterans who survived flame tank service often kept their gloves long after the war, blackened and stiff with petroleum residue, a tangible reminder of the machine that had nearly consumed them. The transformation these weapons wrought was not in battlefield tactics. Flame tanks were ultimately too specialized, too vulnerable, too resource-intensive to alter the strategic trajectory of the war. Rather, they transformed understanding of the boundaries of mechanized warfare and the limits of psychological weapons. The Germans had succeeded in creating a weapon of extraordinary terror, but terror alone could not win battles once armies learned to master their fear. Soviet forces, after initial encounters, developed effective countermeasures, both tactical and psychological. The flame tank went from nightmare to target, from invincible horror to vulnerable priority. The crews who operated them underwent their own transformation, from elite specialists to traumatized survivors of a weapon system that consumed its operators as readily as its targets. The last documented use of a German flame tank in combat occurred on May 1, 1945, in the rubble-choked streets near the Reichstag. The vehicle, a Flammpanzer III, whose original markings had been painted over multiple times, emerged from a side street and discharged flame into a Soviet-occupied apartment block. The building caught immediately, flame billowing from every window. The Soviet infantry responded with concentrated anti-tank rifle fire, penetrating the vehicle's side armor. The Flammpanzer exploded in a fireball visible across the entire district, its fuel reservoir igniting in a sympathetic detonation that scattered burning petroleum across a 50-meter radius. No crew members survived. The building they had targeted burned for 6 hours before collapsing. In the morning, Soviet engineers counted 17 bodies in the ruins, German and Russian both, impossible to distinguish in their final incinerated state. There exists in the grim calculus of warfare a boundary between weapons that kill and weapons that transcend killing to become instruments of pure horror. The German flame tank occupied this terrible frontier, a machine that did not simply defeat enemies, but immolated them, that transformed the battlefield into something older than modern war, something primal and elemental. Fire has been humanity's servant and destroyer since the first spark was captured from lightning, and the Flampanzer represented a dark inversion of that relationship. Fire not harnessed for warmth or light, but concentrated into a weapon that reduced human beings to ash and terror. The tanks themselves are long since scrapped, melted down, their steel returned to more peaceful purposes. But the memory persists in the accounts of those who faced them, in the nightmares of those who operated them, in the historical record that documents what happens when technological capability exceeds moral wisdom. The flame tanks were night terrors made metal, and when they finally burned themselves out in the ruins of the Reich they had served, they took with them not just their crews, but a particular kind of darkness, a demonstration of how far the machinery of war could descend into mechanized hell. What remains is not triumph or tactical innovation, but a cautionary monument, a reminder that some weapons damage not just the body but the soul, and that the fire we unleash upon others has a way of consuming us all.